So earlier we discussed something historical. Okay, we're talking about Ian Levine putting together this massive collection and all the time and everything it took. But what we need to discuss is 20 years.
Jeff, it's crazy to think about it. It's a little fun, like there was a time where collectors didn't have an option to grade comics. That wasn't a thing, putting it behind plastic, encapsulating it. But back in 2000, when the Certified Guarantee Company decided to open up their doors to the comic book collectors market, they started something big, something that would evolve the hobby like nothing that has been seen in the comic book industry in decades.
All right, before we get into this, comic fam, I need you to slap that like, because we're going to get into some information here and discuss in 2000 what everybody was submitting, and in up to 2020 what we're submitting now. And you're going to find out what is the top submitted books in the census.
That's right. This is what the community cared about most back then, all the way up to now. Let's start it out at the year 2000, that first year. Oh, look at that. There's a spider right there, just going right onto the desk, just freaking all the way from the ceiling. It's like right there. Oh my gosh. We're going to start in 2000 when the comic scene was hit with this option to put a comic book behind a slab and get a number put on it to signify its grade and its condition. Back in 2000, people rushed. They rushed to send in just over 1,000 copies of what would be the highest graded comic book year one of submissions. We have Spawn #1.
I really love this little picture here of what we have. This is a fascinating scene because we're finding out what people are submitting. I mean, this is a company that's not established yet. Okay, and you're sending them off to a strange place to have them put in plastic, but you have enough trust to give them your collectible books. And if we look on this list, we're seeing stuff as Fantastic Four 48, Star Wars 1, Wolverine 1, Wolverine Unlimited 1. I mean, we're seeing very popular books that are heading out there, okay, in mass quantity.
These were the books that the people cared about. These are the ones that they immediately went to their collection to send in. And yeah, Fantastic 448, major key. You would expect that to be sent in. But what I find interesting is that under 500 people did this, and that near double the amount of submissions were sent of Wolverine the Origin issue #1 in that first year. Isn't that interesting to think about? But it makes sense because that year that book came out. So aside from having Spawn 1, something from the 90s people had in their back issue been waiting for decades to be sent down to Florida to be encapsulated. Well, they also had a brand new comic book that hit the stands that year. Wolverine, an origin issue, a minor key, something that people don't really care about that much for collector's value right now. But back in 2000, 2001, when this book came out, yeah, this was the second most graded comic book ever.
Yeah, it just seems like the timing worked out perfectly for that book to come out the same year as this company's opening up, and it was hot, it was new, and that's what happened with its numbers. So I'm excited to see here the continuation into the next segment of this.
Yeah, especially because that following year, Wolverine the Origin #1, for that very reason, would actually take the reign as the most graded book, clear up until 2003.
So this chart is great because it's showing also what was hot and collectible that particular time frame, and then what's also going to stand through the test of time. So that we see Wolverine Origins 1 at first place here by 2003. But what we also are seeing is the Spider-Man Volume 2, number 36. Okay, we had the 9/11 incident, and this comic really hot on the heels of that. And that was a huge book for many, many people. It was a very special book, still is to this day. I love that book. And so did many others. And we're seeing how many people submitted that book this time frame.
1,400 submissions that year. This right here marks a major moment in comic book collecting because we have something that happened in mainstream, in culture, in American history that directly affected modern comic book collecting, and it's showing right here in the grading census data. So between 2004 and 2007, we see a lot of comic books start to creep up, and we see some changes in placement, but a lot of the comic books remain the same except for one. One outshines the rest, and we're talking an increase of copies graded of 2,000 in a short 3 years, something unprecedented until this time. And we're seeing ASM 300 take the cake at over 4,400 copies graded.
So this also shows the popularity of some of these characters. 11 of the top 12 books were either Wolverine or Spider-Man. I mean, right behind Amazing Spider-Man 300 is Wolverine the Limited Series with 4,440. It's only 24 less than the Amazing Spider-Man 300 had. Okay, and then a far below that, but still in third place, would be Incredible Hulk 181, which had 3,423. We're talking really large numbers of really amazing key books and still fairly common books when you look on this census.
Yeah, we're even seeing some of the more moderate keys start to creep up on this list as well, such as ASM 252, almost 3,000 copies graded, and another approaching the higher end slot on this list. We have Marvel's Superhero Secret Wars issue number 8, also approaching that 3,000 mark. You're starting to see the taste of collectors showing these numbers. They're hunting Venom keys. They're hunting Black Suit keys. They're hunting Wolverine appearances and solo series. Well, let's see what they're starting to hunt as we move into the end of the decade.
So we're going to jump ahead to 2012. CGC is clearly well established by now. They've been around for 12 years. And the idea of collecting comics in an encapsulated format is already now ingrained in the collectible. And what we're seeing with these numbers are very similar, but what we're finding out now are new hot books, new established characters that are really taking a grip of the community itself. We're seeing New Mutants 98 now making a very strong move into this chart, and X-Men 266 jumping up slots as well.
New Mutants 98 wasn't even on the higher end of this list until recent years, and now we're seeing it clear past 3,000 total copies graded. Issue 266 of X-Men clear past 3,700 copies graded. Another one that was way lower on the list, but members of the community started gravitating towards certain heroes. As you said, Jeff, and Deadpool and Gambit are definitely fan favorites, and it's being shown here. And I think it's also worth noting that the hikes in Wolverine and Spider-Man keys are unlike anything else on this list.
So when I look at 2012, I find it to be really fascinating because 5 years ago in 2007, which we just discussed, the top two books were Amazing Spider-Man 300 in first, and second was Wolverine Limited Series number 1 in second. Those books only had a 24-issue difference in 2007. 5 years later, when it's 2012 that we're discussing this, it's only a 25-book difference. They kept the same pace. That's unbelievable if you really think about that.
Yeah, the same interest. It kept consistent. And we're starting to see these trends start to form as we approach current times. Let's take a look at the following couple years. We're about to break a record here in 2014, Jeff, with ASM 300 quickly approaching 10,000 total copies graded on the census. 2014 has a lot of the same comics we've chatted about. Hulk 181 growing in numbers, Secret Wars 8 growing in numbers. However, New Mutants 98. Ooh, this book is starting to creep up. We're showing in 2014 a low count of just over 6,000 copies graded of this issue, and that is starting to increase because it is at this point we were hearing word of a Deadpool movie approaching, casting being called. Let's take a look at what a movie does to a comic on the census.
Before we move on, I do want to make a note here. Take a look at Spawn 1, how far down this chart has fallen, and find out where it's going to end up here in 2020. We're at 4,000 issues here in 2014.
All right, let's take a look at 2017, where Spawn ended up, and a year fresh of Deadpool being out in cinema. What is the census count?
This hero, or anti-hero, however you want to look at him, has jumped into second place with almost 14,000 books submitted for grading to CGC.
Holy smokes. Major change for this book. This book wasn't even really high on the list to begin with. And then in recent times, takes second place, Boots Wolverine, Boots Hulk 181, Spidey 300 still holding the slot at close to 15,000.
We know how big Deadpool has been. He's been a phenomenon. So there's no surprise in 2017 to see him take this spot. But it is still a little shocking to find out how many of them were submitted just in that small time frame.
So New Mutants has gone up in that short amount of time, over 8,000 copies added to the census, copies encapsulated, graded behind plastic forever. And Spawn in that time has gone up to just over 7,000 copies graded, an increase of just over 3,000 in that time. So that tells you how the community has embraced Deadpool compared to other characters such as Spawn, who I will remind you was the #1 graded comic back in 2000 when CGC came on the scene.
We are in 2020. Let's go back here, check out 2019. And I want to mention one book in particular, X-Men 94. This has been on the list since the beginning. Okay, this has had 6,500 copies graded by CGC. Another book on this list I want to talk about is Star Wars. Now, there's been a lot of hype behind Star Wars in the movies, so that is definitely strong on here and seen a lot of submission gains and movements in its spots.
We even see Savage She-Hulk start to creep up on this list at slot 20. And the only reason why that would be here is because of the Disney Plus announcements that were starting to pour in around that time earlier in the year. Let's take a look at 2020 now. Our most recent census data coupled with some other information that, Jeff, I'm excited to report on because we have some private signing numbers that have recently been updated.
So by the end of April in 2020, these are the final numbers for the most graded books.
Kicking out the year 2020 with a kind of newcomer to the top of this list, we have ASM 361 approaching the top just above Spawn #1 and Secret Wars 8 at a near 15,000 copies submitted for grading. Carnage is coming to theaters soon, and collectors are actively submitting ASM 361 in preparation for his appearance. We also see Wolverine issue #1 from the limited series hit just above 15,000 at the #3 spot. #2 on this list is New Mutants 98 with a staggering 18,500 copies encapsulated. And then #1, to no surprise, ASM issue #300, the first full appearance of Venom, near 22,000 copies graded.
This gives so much clarity to me of what is the demographic and the collectability of the comic fam and what's being submitted out there and what's truly in interest to collectors. And I want to dig a little deeper because we just had a Todd McFarlane signing, and I took images from CGC Census of how many Spawn 1s and how many Spider-Man 300s were signed at that point and how many we have now. So let's take a look here for a second.
So what was the total amount of Spawn copies signed on the census prior to the Todd McFarlane signing?
So before this Todd McFarlane 6 series event that CGC had, we only had 2,145 Spawn 1 signed by him and encapsulated. But now there are 3,780 of them. That's 1,600 more that he did and added now to the census. What's interesting, though, is that in that 1 year time frame from 2019 to 2020, there was only a 2,000 book growth, which says that there was only 400 books submitted to CGC that were not signed by Todd McFarlane.
Not as many people getting Spawn #1s graded without that signature. Now I'm curious, what did Spider-Man 300 look like on your analysis?
Before the SIG series, it was 3,261 copies. After, we now have 4,268 copies. So there were more Spawns. Obviously, I mean, it's a less expensive book and easier to obtain and still a fantastic character that just screams Todd McFarlane. versus Spidey 300s, which is also just an epic book, epic cover, and just screams also Todd McFarlane. So those are the numbers that we have now for these books.
I find these numbers staggering, but also worth providing to the community because we're seeing an increase of copies graded of above 30% for these books after one private signing. We have a lot of private signings that are going to be coming up, and I expect to see a lot more people starting to navigate towards this type of service, especially with the convention season playing out the way it has in 2020. Let's keep an eye out on the CGC Census, and I remind everybody that membership is free on the CGC's website so that you can get access to the CGC forms and to this census data that we're discussing.
I love this type of information. I love this type of data. I think it's really important, and I think we got to stay on top of this, Tom.